For the director of music, of David, the servant of the Lord. I have a message from God in my heart concerning the sinfulness of the wicked. There is no fear of God before their eyes. In their own eyes they flatter themselves too much to detect or hate their sin. The words of their mouths are wicked and deceitful. They fail to act wisely or do good. Even on their beds they plot evil. They commit themselves to a sinful course and do not reject what is wrong. Your love, Lord, reaches to the heavens, your faithfulness to the skies. Your righteousness is like the highest mountains, your justice like the great deep. You, Lord, preserve both people and animals. How priceless is your unfailing love, O God. People take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house. You give them drink from your river of delights. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light we see light. Continue your love to those who know you, your righteousness to the upright in heart. May the foot of the proud not come against me, nor the hand of the wicked drive me away. See how the evildoers lie fallen, thrown down, not able to rise.
Thanks, Libby. Thanks, Libby. Can you hear that? Hey. So a big part of understanding what the Psalms are all about and understanding how we can feel better by learning how to better feel is to recognize that they're an expression of devotion. And so our memory verse for this series is an expression of devotion out of Psalm 116. So let's do our memory verse together. I love the Lord, for he heard my voice. He heard my cry for mercy. Because he turned his ear to me, I will call on him as long as I live. Now, this week we're talking about bitterness. I did not select it because it was Mother's Day. I promise. If you paid attention while we read the psalm, you may have come away from the reading of the psalm with the question, how is this psalm about bitterness? Right? Almost all the writings in the Bible are what biblical scholarship calls occasional writings. That is, somebody didn't just sit down because they like writing and say, I think I'm going to write something about this. In almost every case, it's responding to something. Something's going on. So like Paul didn't just sit in jail in Colossae and go, you know what, I think I'll just write a letter. No, like he knew people in Colossae. He knew their names, like he'd ministered there, and he wrote a letter for them, right? In some cases in the Psalms, for example, we know the occasion on which the worship song was written. And so, for example, in 51, it says, in the superscript, it says, the psalm that David wrote after Nathan had confronted him about his adultery with Bathsheba, right? And it's a hymn of repentance. And in 34, it says, the psalm David wrote after he pretended he was a crazy person in the court of Abimelech until Abimelech kicked him out, right? And it's an expression of apparently what he experienced there. However, there's some that just don't have that, like this one. It's a psalm of David, the servant of the Lord. And so the occasion is what sometimes in pastoral work we call the fallen condition focus. That is, we have a particular condition made in the image of God, broken in sin and depravity, and we are these kind of people. And so what is it in us this is for? Right? This is care, this is supply, this is medicine, this is help, this is a way to encourage faith and transformation and salvation and deliverance and all those kinds of things. This psalm is for that. And the question is, what is it aimed at? What in our fallen condition? And by reading the psalm, we know, if we pay attention to what it said, that it's something that would cause us to deceive ourselves and distrust God's goodness from verses 1 to 4, and something that would make us a schemer and take no joy in God's great goodness or any delight in him. Because the psalm is trying to help us with those. And it's important to remember that when we're dealing with a psalm, it's not only dealing with just the intellectual of it, it's a poem. It's dealing with something that's of the heart, that's more visceral, that we're also thinking through. It's trying to do something that's emotionally as well. Now, one of the things that we'd notice if we pay attention to the scriptures as they roll out is that bitterness actually shows up really early in the Bible. So you could argue it starts in chapter 3 where God's like, what did you do? And he's like, well, this woman you gave me. Okay, that's bitterness right there, right? But in chapter 4, after the fall, the first thing that happens, the first major story we get about what sin is going to do to us is Cain and Abel, the first two sons of Adam and Eve, are growing up, and Abel is giving God an offering, and Cain is giving God an offering, except Abel is giving him the first and the best, and Cain apparently is not. And it's clear that God accepts Abel's offering and not Cain's. And we know that Cain is spiraling down into bitterness because God actually talks to him about it. Right? God comes to him and he says, listen, Cain, sin is crouching at your door and it wants to have you, but you have to master it. Right? That is, your bitterness towards your brother is not his fault. He can't fix the fact that he believes and trusts me. You've got to deal with the fact that you hate him for it. He's like, if you gave a good offering, wouldn't I accept it? And the answer is, of course. But Cain doesn't deal with it. He doesn't master it. Instead, he masters his brother's life and kills him. In Exodus 15, the very first thing that happens after the deliverance of the people of Israel. So God sends Moses to save them out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. They come through the Red Sea. The Red Sea closes on the Egyptians. The very next thing that happens is they go out 3 days into the desert, which is just enough time in the desert to run out of water. And they come to a lake. And they try to drink water out of the lake, and the Bible says that it's bitter. That is, that either salt water is leached in or something like that, but it's undrinkable, it's unusable. And ultimately what we find out spiritually is that it's a test. God wants to see how these people will respond, right? And what they do, the way they respond is they complain and they threaten Moses. And it says in that passage that Moses cried out to God, and it's this very cryptic verse, okay? And I've read the Jewish commentators on this, and they don't say much about it. It just says, God showed Moses a piece of wood, and Moses took the wood and he threw it in the water, and then the water became sweet. Not just okay, but it became great water, right? Now, in Ephesians, the Apostle Paul tries to clarify for us the significance and just how poisonous bitterness is. There's a verse in 4:31 and 32. He says this, get rid of all bitterness, rage, anger, brawling, and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as Christ forgave you. So part of the context here is that bitterness precedes what Paul wants to tell us about getting rid of malice. Malice is like basically all the anger, all the violence, all the hatred that wants to come out of us. And he says, the first thing is get rid of all your bitterness. Because all the rage and anger and brawling and slander, and including the bitterness itself, are all forms of malice, hatred, anger, attack of others. And then he says, but instead treat each other with kindness and compassion. What do you have to do in order to be able to treat people with kindness and compassion? You have to forgive them, right? And what does that mean, right? It essentially means you give up your right to bitterness. Bitterness is, by definition, the effect on our hearts of unresolved offense. That's what bitterness is, right? Some kind of offense. We believe we deserve better. We believe we should have gotten better. We believe we should have been treated better. We believe something else should have been better towards God or other people. It comes into our hearts. It gets mixed up with our self-justification. It doesn't get resolved through faith and grace and forgiveness, and it festers and it grows. And then it comes out in all kinds of forms of malice towards everybody, including God and our neighbor, right? But if we want to actually be kind and compassionate to others, like God would want us to be, well, the first things we have to do in order to be able to be honestly kind and compassionate is we have to get rid of our bitterness. We have to forgive. And we have to do it on the basis of the fact that Jesus forgave us. Now, one of the issues with bitterness is it's one of those sins that we talk about a lot in church, and we can see its effects in the Bible, and it's not hard to see in everybody around us, and yet we don't think we have it. If somebody asked you before you walked this morning, are you a bitter person, just generally speaking? Almost all of us would say, no, I'm not a bitter person. But bitterness is one of those things that you could call a denial condition. It is so painful and personally humiliating to see bitterness in you because it's so animalistic, it's so visceral, it's so immature, it's so stupid in a way. I don't mean hurt, I mean the bitterness, the internal spiraling rage, right? That it's really humiliating to see it there. And so we have this way of laying sophistication over it so we don't have to see it, right? And so we call pride assertiveness, and we call fear anxiety, right? Just to make it harder to spell in Scrabble. And when we come to bitterness, we act like it's not there. And yet, it's so obvious in your neighbor. And it's partly because we actually don't know how poisonous bitterness can be and how it grows and what it does. So there's this verse in Hebrews that's pretty well known where the writer says, see to it that no one misses the grace of God and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. Do you see the antinomial parallelism? The opposite meaning, one is a positive, one is a negative, right? So the first is, make sure nobody misses the grace of God. Why? What will happen if you receive the grace of God? You'll receive what? From God? Forgiveness. Its effect on you will be, what will you do towards your neighbor? Forgive, right? So let's be really careful that none of us, not one of us, misses the grace of God and its effect. And the opposite is also true. Don't let any bitter root grow up and cause trouble and defile everybody. Because remember, bitterness comes out as malice, right? Now, if you aren't a gardener, I don't know if you know this, but gardening is the most popular hobby in America. It's pretty sexy, right? And so Mother's Day in Wisconsin is the 90% year past the frost date, and most people put their gardens in this weekend. And most people would think, wait, Nick, that's kind of a weird verse because roots grow down, right? And they grow out. Why grow up? Roots by definition don't grow up. Roots grow down, right? That's how you get stable trees and all that kind of stuff. You are right and wrong. There are a bunch of plants that the way they reproduce is by roots. They actually grow their roots, then on their roots, they grow a little tumor of stored energy. And then they have little tiny seeds attached to the root, and then the main plant dies. And then that root stays there through the winter, through the fall, and it just waits for the opportune moment to grow up into a plant. And it doesn't really need anything. That's why growing potatoes and onions isn't that hard. Because you don't have to do everything right for the seed, because normally seeds will run out of energy really fast. If there isn't water and nutrients, they're gonna die. But the great thing about potatoes and onions and tulips is there's the seed, but there's all this stored energy there, right? And when the moment is right, it grows up into a plant and uses up some of that energy. And what the writer is saying here is, that's what bitterness is like. Bitterness is like that potato, right? In and of itself, it's not doing much. It's just there and growing. As long as we don't deal with it, as long as we pretend it's not there. And it is just waiting for the opportune moment to shoot up, grow up, and release what? What is the plant in this context, biblically? Malice, hatred, anger, raging, snideness, all mistreatments of other people, right? And every single one of us has got a bitterness rage potato, okay? You can quote me on that. No charge. They're all different sizes for all of us, but they're there. And they've got to go, because if they're there, they'll grow, and they're just waiting for the right moment to grow up and do something. Now, in that context, Psalm 36 is incredibly good treatment. And the main focus, I think, to start with would be verse 9, where it says, "For with you is the fountain of life, and in your light we see light." Which is intentionally meant to contrast the previous verses, which show that one of the immediate effects of bitterness is that it makes us blind. Okay, so there's two parts to this. The first is that we see the light we see by God's light, first of all, is the fear of God. That is, without the fear of God, bitterness grows, and bitterness is blindness. It always produces blindness. It's how we cannot be the polar bear. It's how we can keep ourselves from being humiliated by finding bitterness everywhere in our lives, right? So if you look at the first 4 verses, right? The first verse says, there's no fear of God before their eyes. The immediate result of that is that in their own eyes they flatter themselves, so that we cannot see our sin and we cannot hate our sin. It's the very next step. Then, once that happens, once we get in that new emotional blindness about what we're really like and what our sin is like and not being concerned about it, it'll lead us to talk a different way about who we really are. And it'll lead us to start omitting our interest in God's wisdom and our willingness to do what's good. Right? We might not do a lot of things that society doesn't like, but we will not actively pour ourselves out. Why? Because pouring yourself out is by definition what? Grace, right? It's unmerited generosity. And bitterness makes us ungracious people. It is by definition ungraciousness. If you've got a big old potato of ungraciousness inside of you, what kind of person is that going to make you? An ungracious person. And so all of the small goods that lay in front of you, they're all around you, every moment, in every interaction with every person, you just kind of stop doing them. And ultimately where it'll lead you is brooding on your bed in wickedness, right? That's what verse 4 says. It says that the person is awake at night, swirling around on this. I'm going to tell that person this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to get that promotion out from under him. I'm going to blah, blah, blah. I'm going to kill him in this divorce. I'm going to, right? It's essentially the place of damnation, right? You're so inward focused, blind to what you're seeing. Listen, it's really important to recognize that the very first step, that if there's no fear of God before our eyes, then in our own eyes, we're going to flatter ourselves and we can't see our sin or hate our sin. The only thing that can ever get us free from sin, especially the sin of bitterness that leads to so many others, is that you have to see it for what it is and you have to hate it for what it is. Now, it's true. See, so in our culture likes to, it's so funny because our culture likes to believe it's so educated and so into nuanced distinctions, and then it erases all the meaningful, helpful distinctions, right? So hatred is a great example of that. Hate, always bad. Don't hate, no haters. Stop with your hate. You disagree with me, you hate, you're a hater. Everything's hate, right? It's always bad. Hatred is an incredibly important emotion, okay? Incredibly important. You need it for a number of things, and it's very easily misused. That's why Jesus can tell you to love your enemies, because that's the first person you want to hate, right? But he never takes away the biblical command that you should hate sin. Namely, and first, yours. Because until you really do hate it, it will be part of your bitterness tumor that you are constantly taking a little comfort from, even though you might not give it a lot of space. And it just kind of grows there until the root grows up and defiles everything. And so the remedy to this is to reverse engineer the verses, right? If I don't want to be scheming on my bed of all my malice and hatred, then I need to not speak rashly and speak humbly, and I need to actually seek God about God's wisdom and goodness, which means I'm going to have to see my sin and hate it. But what can ground me that deeply in my capacity for self-deception that I won't flatter myself and I won't do that in a way that causes me not to see anything real about me? And the answer is the fear of God. You see, fear is another one of those verses that we don't want to have any distinctions about. Fear is always bad, right? That's not true. Like your fear your fear of driving drunk is a really good fear. Your fear of doing all kinds of things in relationships that would destroy them. I remember a lot of couples have this experience where they're like, they get married, they're a few years into their marriage, and they're talking about something that happened, and somebody else says, oh, this couple, and like one of them had an affair, and they're like getting this horrific divorce, right? And then oftentimes one of them, often the female, will say something like this: if you ever did that to me, I would be gone, right? Now, that's never happened to me, of course. But generally speaking, like there's a purpose for that. That's to put the fear of something into that person, right? Like I want you to know that this is really serious, right? And that can be a helpful fear. Now, it's a very unchristian fear, because if the fear of God can't do it, I don't know what can, right? But the point is that there's lots of things that if you see their real end, if you see what they're going to do to you and other people, and if you see how alluring they are, and if you get a sense of like viscerally, just in terms of your just how much you actually really want to get in there, you'll be terrified of them and you will hate them, right? Like most of the men I've talked to that do pornographic stuff, one of the reasons why they've been stuck in it for so many years is because they don't really hate it yet. They think it's bad. They think they shouldn't do it. They know that their wife or their girlfriend or whatever, like if they found out or if they do know that it's humiliating to them, they know all that stuff. But they don't think of themselves as a pervert, and they don't hate pornography and what it does to everybody else and what it does to society and what it does to them and how it grows up and defiles everything, right? And the problem is that you just want it too dang much to get free of it without hating it. And bitterness is the same way. Bitterness is more alluring than pornography. It's more alluring than almost everything, because it is ultimately just self-justification. It's the greatest prostitute in your heart. And so if you can't see it and you can't hate it, you can't get free of it. And the only thing that can ground you enough so that in the moment of your bitter hatred, you'll be like, oh my goodness, this is like, I'm this bitter person, is the fear of God. God has to be so big, so morally serious, so ultimately truthful, so unmanipulatable, so direct, so requiring of our obedience, and so powerful in his presence that it makes us tremble, right? It says in Isaiah, I think it's chapter 60, that the one to whom he will look is the one who's humble in heart and who trembles at my word, right? Now, that's what fear of the Lord means. Like you can play with the word respect and all that kind of stuff. And you can be like, well, is it respect or is it fear? Okay, so the word respect in our culture stinks, because in our culture you can respect somebody and not do anything they say. So I know it's fun to get away from the word fear, because in our culture fear is used as this negative, right? But respect isn't strong enough. And so ultimately it has to be a respectful fear that when you feel it causes you to physically tremble. Okay? If you get to the point where like, when you think about what God is really like, it causes you to like shake in your boots a little bit. Okay? In the good fear sense of like it's grounding. Boom. Fear the Lord. And it's the only thing that can ground you. And because of that, it's the only thing that can wipe away the self-deception, the blindness of bitterness, which is one of our greatest needs. And it's the only thing that can make us hate the sin enough once we see it to really want so desperately to get free of it. And even though in this passage, David doesn't argue that it's a progression of these four things, in other passages of the Bible, it does show that it is a progression. For example, in these two verses from Proverbs, it straight up says, the fear of God is really the beginning of everything good. It's the beginning of real wisdom and real knowledge, right? Now, the second half of the psalm focuses on what we can see, the light we can see through God's light, and specifically in relationship to God's goodness. That is, that in order to overcome bitterness, we don't just have to hate our sin or hate our bitterness. We have to be able to see something besides our bitterness that's worth paying attention to, and we have to be able to see something better than our bitterness that's worth paying attention to, right? And so David focuses on three of the attributes of God's goodness that are specifically aimed at attacking our bitterness, right? So he says, God is loving and faithful, and he intentionally puts those in parallel because they're essentially the same thing. If you think you can be loving without being faithful, all I can say is you must be young. Because as you live your life, everybody ultimately realizes that whatever anybody professes, whatever anybody claims or says, the claim of love is pretty worthless without unflappable, unfailing faithfulness. Otherwise, who cares? If you're not going to be there, who cares? And the reason why God's love is so astounding and so transformative, and the reason why it's better than your bitterness and better than my bitterness, is because it's faithful love. It's generous, it's beautiful, and it's faithful. It's unflappable, it's unfailing, right? And then he says, and your righteousness and justice are great. And he says that because bitterness is the belief that we have been treated unrighteously and unjustly by God. You see, if we just believe that if we're Christians and we believe in God and we have the fear of the Lord causing us to tremble and our heart is turned to him towards faith, and somebody does something really bad to us, right? We don't have to become bitter about that because we can believe that God can work it towards good. We can believe that in God's providence, that walking through his suffering, we can somehow attain the resurrection from the dead, like it says in Philippians 3, that there's all kinds of things that could be happening in all of that. We don't have to actually grow bitter. Bitterness begins to grow all the more when we think that in the midst of all that, God has also been unjust with us. And the reason why David says you are righteous and you are just is because he wants himself to think of, and he wants everybody who sings this worship song to say, I have not been wronged. When it comes to God, I have not been wronged. When it comes to God and what should have happened to you, you have not been wronged. He has not wronged you. It doesn't mean your life hasn't been hard or painful. It doesn't mean that you aren't suffering terribly right now. And you may be suffering or have dealt with stuff that seems like it couldn't have been your fault. So how could this happen? And therefore shouldn't have God in his sovereignty done something. And this verse is there to tell you so that you can sing with all your heart, I have not been wronged. Right? And then the third thing he says is that God preserves. And he says, not just people, but animals. She throws animals in there. It's nice, right? That's where we get animal preserve from. It's from the Bible. And so, Jesus said at one point about worry, and worry is often bound up with bitterness, right? Because if you're worrying about something, who's not going to take care of you, right? And shouldn't they have taken care of you? And then why didn't they take care of you? And now you're here all by yourself, trying to handle things all alone, right? Ooh. And he's saying, no, God, you preserve. Jesus said the sparrows don't have barns where they store away, but God feeds them. In fact, the one-day flowers that grow up and then they're burned away, God cares about them. So how much more does he care about you? And David says in here, God, you preserve us. That is, no matter what you're going through, no matter how much you feel like you should have been treated better, you've been wronged, you have not been abandoned. You have not been abandoned. If you combine whatever it is you've been through and whatever you're going through with faith, you are not abandoned. That's not the kind of God that God is. And if you feel bitter about his abandoning of you, the problem is that somewhere along the line, you've lost the fear of the Lord. And self-flattery in your pain has slowly entered in. So you can't see anymore your sin or hate it, and it's messing with your head. It's trapping you until you're swirling around in your bed at night, right? But he doesn't just say these three things. He goes on to the next verse. He's like, we need to value these things. You can't just be like, yeah, God's good. Because one of the biggest problems with Christians and bitterness, let me just cut this straight with you, and I know this from personal experience, okay? It's one of the biggest problems with Christians. We all have a bitterness potato. If it hasn't caused you to lose your faith yet, and you are a believer, so you become a believer, you haven't lost your faith yet through bitterness, because bitterness will destroy your faith. Okay, and you're in here. Here's what it tends to look like, and this is how you know you're losing your faith. When you think God has done just enough to fulfill those three requirements. so that if you accused him of not being loving and faithful, or if you accused him of not being righteous or just, or if you accused him of not being preserving towards you, like you wouldn't be able to like get him. He's unjust enough, so if you accused him of it, like you wouldn't be able to get a conviction, right? If you could drag him into court, but he hasn't really done anything more than that. And who wants to be with somebody who does the minimum? Come on now. Let's quit pretending we're good people now. It'll kill you. And so he starts in verse 7 and he says, about God's unfailing love that he's just said exists, he says, how priceless is God's unfailing love. People both high and low, that is rich and poor, important and not important, find refuge in the shadow of your wings. That is, that God's love is priceless yet costless. Now think about that in a supply demand, you can never get enough. When can I, give me what I deserve society? Among a give me what I want race. There is something in the world, the only thing in the world that is priceless and costless. There's nothing like that. Except one thing, God's unfailing love. Right? And the next verse he says that those who've believed in and trusted in God's unfailing love and that have been freed through the fear of God from the spiraling blindness of bitterness, that those people feast on the abundance of your house and you give them to drink from the river of your delights. You see why he said that? Because he felt the same thing you and I feel. That God does just barely enough that we can't get a conviction. But that's not real. Paul's saying that's not real. Or David's not saying that's not real. He's saying we're blind in our bitterness, right? Like our bitterness potato is just like winding around our face. Like we can't see it. Like so we're like, oh, God's probably there, but this is really bad. Well, it probably is really bad, but that does not mean that God is doing the minimum. God is not doing the minimum. Imagine yourself like in a potable river flowing past you and you are trying to drink it. And you're sipping some here and getting a little bit there. I mean, you can't even drink all the water out of a drinking fountain, right? Am I right? Have you ever tried to do that? I've tried to do that before. It's so hard. You're like trying to find a way to get all the water of this tiny little spurt, right? And you're like, I can't get it all. And it's falling out of your mouth and gravity's down on your side. And maybe if they did it like this, you know what I'm saying? You can't but take a sip out of a river. Thousands of cubic feet per second just blowing past you, and you're getting a little sip. And what David is saying is, that is what the goodness of God is like. You see? Do you see how that's necessary? To push back with sufficient force on this sort of like conniving blindness of our bitterness. We need that truth to come in and say, no, quit it with that. No, the reason you and I want to believe that God's goodness is the minimum is so we can keep our bitterness. That's why. Don't you see? Because we want to keep our bitterness, and our bitterness says, God isn't enough. God's not doing enough. God should be doing more. He's not particularly righteous, right? And God is saying that he's righteous, and we go, okay, well, maybe he's just barely righteous enough, but I'm really suffering a lot. And he really could do more. And I can keep my bitterness, and I can salve my feeling off of it and feel good self-justification. Ooh, that feels good. And I can believe in God, and maybe I can feel good about that. It's not going to work. Because God is going to take that little bitterness thing that sits in that place of his goodness, the place of our belief goodness about ourselves. And he's going to kick that thing into orbit. And he's like, all that goodness place that you want for your self-goodness, that is all mine. It's all mine. You and I, we're not good. And the best that we can do is drift along and sip from the carrying river of God's abundant goodness and recognize that when we eat out of the feast of the abundance of his house. Every good thing in our life, everything that there is pouring out of him. And it's only our bitterness that says, no, everything good I do, all these good things, I do these good things. We humans, we do these good things. And all this stuff, that's your fault, God, you should do more. And then verse 9, he says, for with you is the fountain of life. He means that in the most holistic way possible. And it comes, what is a fountain? A fountain is gracious, right? It just pours out. It comes up out of nowhere, right? And it just gives. And he says, and in your light, we see light. That is, there are some truths, the truths that save, that liberate, that deliver, that create love and bonds and hope, that reveal truth, that raise us up to nobility as we were created to be, that help us to walk in the Spirit, that do all these things that come from God's wisdom, right? The very wisdom that in the blindness of our bitterness, we can't see. We're not interested in wisdom. We just want to talk, right? We don't want to learn the wisdom and do what's good. We want to just talk. Do you recognize in our lives that at all? People who talk a lot and don't seek wisdom deeply and don't do the good that's right in front of them with courtesy and respect and love. Do you see that at all? He says, in your light, we see light, right? Now, there's a couple of really interesting passages about bitterness in the Bible. Acts 8, Simon Mangus is a really good one to read. I'm not going to talk about right now. In the book of Ruth, a lot of people believe the book of Ruth is about Ruth because it's, named after her. But the book actually begins and ends with Naomi. The name Naomi in Hebrew means pleasant, right? But when her husband dies and both of her sons die, she has nothing in the land of Moab, which is not where she's born. She's an immigrant there, right? She goes back home with this daughter-in-law, Ruth, who stays with her. And they say, Naomi, you're back. And she says, no, I have a new name. What's her new name? Mara, right? Which is what the Israelites named that lake they went to, because Mara in Hebrew means bitter, right? But the book of Ruth ends with Naomi being called Naomi again. Because through all the stuff with Ruth, she meets Boaz and she falls in love with him and he loves her and they get married and it's very touching and romantic. And then Ruth gets pregnant and she has a son named Obed, which means servant. And what do they do with Obed? They don't put him on Ruth's breast, they put him on Naomi's knee. And all of her friends say, Naomi, God has given you a son. And you see, through all of that, Naomi got her name back. The one who was bitter became pleasant again. The water that was bitter became sweet. Through faith, through waiting and seeing and experiencing God's provision, his goodness, the story that he laid out. As I've been working through this week, I don't think of myself as a bitter person. Most of the people who know me, I don't generally think of me as a bitter person. I'm a really bitter person, I realized. It's the problem with being a pastor is you're supposed to actually think about for yourself what you preach on, right? Man, it was really humiliating, right? So one of the things that a lot of adults struggle with in terms of bitterness that they won't even admit to their counselor or their pastor or their spouse, certainly not their small group, is how much they resent their children. And it's, on one level, it's nobody's fault, and another level, it's everybody's fault. And it's almost universal. And it's almost universal for kids resenting their parents, too. So let's just be fair about this, right? But parents, by definition, we pour so much into our kids, and we pour it into them before they can even really receive it, right? And we remember all the things we do for them, and they remember all the things we don't do for them. You know what I mean? And there's this enormous amount of investment. And how could a kid, you give them life, you diaper them, you pamper them, you feed them, you do everything for them, right? How could they ever be sensible of that? I mean, most of it happened before they could even have a memory, right? I mean, they're still basically bipedal goldfish, and you're pouring out your life for them, And then, you're hoping at some point in their 20s or when they have kids, they'll be like, Mom and Dad, thanks. But but like, especially when they get in those teen years, one of the reasons why there's all this angst and fighting in the teen years is because the kids are finally old enough to learn all that you have to teach them, and they've got so many super important lessons still to learn, and you can give them to them, and they can be further along than you, and they can not make all your mistakes and mistakes that you, and they don't care, and they're like, whatever. I'm cool, I got it. You don't even know what you're talking about, because human nature, of course, in life is totally different than when you were younger, right? And the seething, bitter anger and bitterness. And as a parent, you're not supposed to show any of that bitterness, because you're the big person, and here's what happens. You hold back the malice, and the potato grows. Bitterness just grows, right? And guess what? It's just waiting for the right time to come out. And then you say stuff to your kids or to your wife or to people, and you're like, where's all that coming from? It's coming from the potato. You got to dig up the potato. So I'm bitter at my kids. I also realized that I'm bitter at basically everyone. Right? So more and more in America, you hear people saying that America's a democracy, right? Of course, America wasn't ever supposed to be a democracy, but people think that now because they don't know their civics and nobody teaches them any of that stuff. Winston Churchill once said that democracy is the worst form of government ever invented by man, except for all the others. And the reason he said that is he said you can ultimately narrow down the definition of democracy to 2 wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for lunch. Okay, there's nothing more. Democracy is as tyrannical as monarchialism. It's just as tyrannical. It's a group of people, one or more, inflicting their will on everybody else in a country that is divided by 1 or 2%. Now, when there's a king and he makes everybody do stuff, everybody just hates the king. In a democracy where other people are forcing and being tyrannical over other people, if they can get a couple more votes than the other people, that's a great recipe for everybody hating everyone. And that's what we're seeing. Look around. And so I have a certain life that I like to live. And in many of the areas that you'd be like, well, you're in the majority straight white male. Well, yeah, except here's the problem. None of us are one thing. And like platforms are like these one things. And so like I'm a fisherman and I'm in the minority and I want people telling me if I can fish, right? There's all kinds of stuff that I do that in all those areas I'm in the minority. That's true about you too. And whenever anybody else, some majority group out there wants to like tell you what you can and can't do, people who don't even do it or don't even care about it, you're like, oh, I hate you. Bitterness. And so I live in a city that's widely known to be secular. I know that probably the majority of the city thinks that I'm stupid for being a Christian. I feel that and I know that. People behave that way, in which I know very clearly they think I'm ruining my own kids' lives and all of that. And I live in a nation that more and more is becoming democratized, tyrannical, that's gonna tell me all kinds of stuff to do, and I feel like I'm gonna lose my liberties, and those are all fairly rational things. And yet, it's bitterness. It's poison in me. And Jesus says, love your enemy. Do good to them. If they ask for something, they take your coat, give it to them. Which could be translated as something like, when they come and take your rights, what are you gonna do? You gonna be mad at them? I guess not. I'm mad now. Right? I was in Colorado this week for a couple days with my family. And one of the things I'm bitter about is where I live. Before I came to Madison, I lived in Florida, like right on the coast. Like I literally could get up from my dinner table, get in the car, put my boat in the water, and have dolphins at the side of my boat that my kids could play with in 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Through most of the seasons of the year. And I love mountains. I grew up as a wilderness leader. Like I've read a lot of Nietzsche and I can argue, and I went to college for 7 years. But listen, I grew up as a kid trapping muskrats in creeks. Okay, like I'm a little redneck at heart, right? Who did a lot of college. And I love the mountains and the streams and the trees and doing things with my hands. And frankly, I'm more interested in elk than in sheep. That's what I know about my heart. You're the sheep, by the way, in that metaphor. And elk are literal elk. And I was preparing for this sermon, and I found this verse that I can't remember ever reading before. in Psalm 76 that said, I still think this is hilarious. You, oh God, you are more majestic than mountains filled with game. How the frick did he know to put that? That's crazy. I was like, it just hurt so much. And I was just like, why am I bitter about this? I got to live 10 minutes from dolphins for 7 years. God sent me to Madison, which is a wonderful place with tons of people who love me, in a church that actually sometimes listens to what I say, and it's a great place to raise kids. I mean, it's like, it's just like, when the fear of God goes, the self-flattery just comes in. And I just deserve more, and I should be able to, and I'm a bitter person. And you might be a bitter person too. And you know what maybe the biggest miracle in the Bible is? I didn't realize it till this week, and I never thought about it quite like this before. But it's got to be that God isn't bitter, right? Like, God is perfect in all things. He creates us. We act like this, right? He gives salvation in Christ. We act like this. And he's not bitter. I mean, how does that work? How does it work that you create a race of sentient beings capable of ultimate goods who wreck and destroy and hate and tear each other apart? They have nothing to be bitter about. Their hearts are filled with bitterness. The malice is sprouting up everywhere. We live in denial and hatred of God himself. We don't want to receive his grace because we don't want to be changed by it. We tell God he's just barely good enough if he's even there, those of us who believe, so we can keep our bitterness potato, which keeps growing every day. And here's God, and he's not bitter. How is that possible? Right? They take the God-man and they crucify him, right? Because the Jewish scriptures say if you're hung on a tree, you're cursed, and so the Jewish leaders wanted to curse him. The Roman leaders used crucifixion to humiliate. They did it to humiliate him, right? Normally, if you're cursed and humiliated, you're going to get bitter. And yet, I mean, even the other guy dying next to him was like hurling insults at him, the Bible says. Like, you think he was busy dying, but he had like extra bitterness to heap on this guy he had never met, right? And like Jesus' huge emotional explosions from the cross were, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. It is finished. Today you'll be with me in paradise. And this is when he really lost control. I'm thirsty. Listen, you guys, this one can teach us how to not be bitter. This one can forgive all the sins of our bitterness. This one can show us what forgiveness looks like. This one can show us how to love our enemies. This one can give us a grounding in the fear of God and a grounding in the goodness of God, that we can be freed from the blindness of our bitterness and we can see something better than our bitterness. This one, and only this one, through his wisdom and his power, can save us from the one thing that we absolutely will not admit is true about us, but is true about all of us. You have to get rid of the potato. In fact, I think it would be really great if, like, in High Point Church Life from now on, when you have a conversation that's really clear somebody's bitter about something, you would say, you need to get rid of that potato. Because you do. You need to get rid of the potato. And you'd be like, well, I don't have any potatoes. Okay, I don't know if you know this. I grew up on a farm. This is how you dig potatoes. You don't know how many there are down there. You just keep digging. And when you find them, you take them out of the dirt and you put them in your bucket. You get rid of them. Well, to eat them, right? And you may not get them all, right? But you just keep digging. And when you find them, you do something about them. You take them out of the soil. And similarly, you may not know, I'm sure I'm bitter about more than just 3 things. I'm just sufficiently humiliated on those 3 big things right this moment that's what I'm dealing with, right? And hopefully when we make some progress on that, here's what I'm going to find out. I'm going to find out there's more potatoes, right? I'm already preemptively humiliated, but that's a good feeling. It's like, after you work out and you're like, oh, that's a good feeling, but I hurt, you know? But you can't just be like, okay, I'm not going to be bitter anymore. That's not how it goes. You have to turn to God, namely in the unbitter person of Jesus. And you have to put your trust in him. And you have to receive his gracious forgiveness. And you have to receive his unbitter love. And you have to learn what it means to love him back and receive love from him and see that he hasn't done the minimum. He's done far beyond what you can imagine. And that in receiving that, there's a way out of your bitterness. So worship team is going to come up. And I want to encourage you. I prefer to beg. Just believe. Believe this morning. Embrace. Let the psalm and its content get in here. Get in here. And let yourself admit the humiliating truth of how bitter you are. Just let yourself admit it. It's okay. Not because it's okay. It's not okay morally. It's okay because Jesus is going to forgive you. He's going to wipe it away. He's going to make it part of the past that no one can bring up again because you two are together and you share in his righteousness and nobody can, if he is for you, no one can be against you. And he can lead you out. And that's where you can feast in his abundance and drink from the river of his delights. God, please help us to take these few minutes now and face this. Help us to see the root of bitterness in us. Help us to know the poison and the malice that it's going to bring up. Help us to know that this is common to humanity. It's not particularly embarrassing. It's an embarrassment we all share. And please help us to see our sin and to hate it and to not be blind to it, and help us to see in you something so much better than our bitterness.